One of the biggest challenges associated with the nomination process is whether the process should be open or closed. From ratification of the Constitution until the 1820s, basically only the congressional leadership was involved in selecting prospective candidates for president. This was otherwise known as King Caucus. It was about as closed as you could get to or as close as you could get to an entirely closed system. The larger the country became, the greater the intensity of the conflicts and the harder it was to manage the nomination process by such a closed system. Enter the national party conventions. The party conventions first began in the early 1830s. This was after you had the fracturing of the Democratic Republicans, with Jackson building the first legitimate mass party apparatus out of the newly formed states in the Ohio Valley from the Louisiana Purchase. There were 8 states admitted to the Union between 1803 and 1821: Ohio, Louisiana, Indiana, Maine, Illinois, Alabama, Missouri, and one other. And those frontier states really formed the populist basis for the newly configured Democratic Party in opposition to those original 13 states. The National Party Conventions expanded the nomination process to include party leaders from the states, but again, these were generally closed affairs reserved for the wealthiest and most influential backers of the parties, the people that controlled the parties back in those states. These conventions were typically pretty informal, and it offered the gradually coalescing parties of the mid-19th century the opportunity to identify points of common interests and plot general election strategy. American political parties in the 19th century were catch-all parties, which meant that ideology was not the organizing feature. The Whigs and the Democrats, therefore, contained a diversity of ideological and economic perspectives. So conventions were a good opportunity to iron out differences on the driving issues of the day, such as how to incorporate new territories in light of the sectional slavery issue, and of course also the tariffs. Frustration over the closed nature of the national conventions emerged in the early 20th century. There was a movement to switch the nomination process to primaries, but state party bosses were able to squelch that movement by making the primaries merely advisory, and so held on to much of their control over the process. Around the middle of the 20th century, the emergency of television opened the way for more candidate-centered campaigns to win the nomination. 1968 would be the last year that a candidate of either party would win the nomination without substantially participating in primary elections, with an eye to winning the majority of the National Convention delegates. And that kind of brings us to the challenge that we face today. Primaries are the most democratic mode of candidate selection for president. However, primary elections require voters to make fine distinctions among candidates who substantially agree with one another on most issues. How good are voters at making those kinds of fine distinctions? Then you have the problem that turnout in primary elections is generally lower than in general elections, and the voters that turn out are generally more ideologically extreme than general election voters. So both parties confront a skewing effect, where Democrats are increasingly likely to nominate candidates that are more liberal than the general electorate prefers, and Republicans are more likely to nominate a candidate too conservative for the general electorate's liking. So what to do? What do you think should be done to ensure that American voters get the kind of candidates that are most likely to succeed regardless of partisan affiliation? Something to think about.